Wouldn't you like to know what it's like to sue the government? How do lawsuits get selected? How do you actually go about filling out paperwork, decide who to sue, where to sue? Who makes the rules on how you sue the government? Would it be nice if you could pick a professional attorney's brain who just does this day in, day out for their entire career? Well, good news. You're in such a place because I was able to talk to attorney Lucas Vebber from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, who does just that. Attorney Vebber is deputy counsel for the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, who basically sues to hold government in check and pushes back against overreaching at whether federal, state, or local levels from coast to coast. He sat down with me to answer some of my questions about this exact topic. So guys, let's get into it. So, Attorney Vebber, suing the government, crash course me. How does this work?
Yeah, so the first thing that most people are surprised to learn is that the general rule is you can't sue the government, right? So the government has what we call sovereign immunity. So at common law, back in the English common law, you couldn't sue the king without the king's permission, essentially. Now, in modern America and in our states, there are many statutes where the government has granted us the ability to sue. But that's kind of the first instance. When you want to sue the government, the first thing you got to do is actually have their permission to sue them. Beyond that, you need to determine if you're going to be in state court or federal court. Typically, there has to be some law that's being violated, some right that's being taken away. If that's your state constitutional rights, you'd be in state court. If that's your federal constitutional rights, you'd likely be in federal court, although you might find yourself in state court too. Then, if you're at the federal level, you may need to exhaust some administrative remedies at the first instance. Same if it's against a state agency in some cases. There may be other things that you have to do, like file what's called a notice of claim. The state of Wisconsin, for example, requires if you're going to sue them and seek money damages, you have to, or a local government there, you have to first tell them you're going to sue them and let them try to rectify it essentially before you sue them. So there's a number of preliminary steps that go in there, but the biggest takeaway is you have to determine what your harm is and what statute allows you to seek redress in the courts.
So when you file, for instance, that notice of claims or anything like that, we're always dealing with important timelines, statute of limitations, all this kind of stuff. So that's one thing that people need to know is if something happens, you feel like you've been aggrieved, you feel like you've been wrong, don't sit on it for 10 years. You need to talk to an attorney now.
Yep, and in some cases, those statutes of limitations begin accruing right away, and in some cases, they run very quickly. So you should absolutely contact an attorney as soon as you possibly can.
It could be, we're not going to go into specifics because, of course, it varies for time and place, but it could be a number of weeks or a couple months, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other thing is you use the phrase exhaust administrative remedies. So, for instance, if we have an administration like the ATF, just hypothetically, were to do something hypothetically, and exhaust the administrative agencies. So in other words, you have to go through their little administrative agency, almost court, or their process within the ATF. And then we have to eventually get to that hard ceiling when they say, nope, this is it. This is where we're drawing a line in the sand. And then you can make the decision to sue or not.
Yeah, and it depends on kind of what the underlying harm is, right? So if you're applying for like a license from an agency, let's say, hypothetically, you're applying for a license, the agency says no to you, you would have to probably go through that full appellate process there. In some cases, you can go straight to court if there's a facial challenge to lawsuit that says this is unconstitutional, and for whatever reason, you can go directly to court. That's another way that you can get there. So it really depends on the individual circumstances, but there's likely going to be a lot of preliminary steps you're going to have to take before you get your day in court.
I realize all this sounds very technical, and is it safe to say that this is something that, like, you don't just pick up a brochure and, like, I stayed at a Holiday Inn, I'm good to go?
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, and certainly a lot of people who do this work and a lot of, expertise that gets developed over the years in this. There are a lot of attorneys who do this kind of stuff, and but it is a highly technical area, and it requires some specialized knowledge just to know where you need to be and how you need to get there.
So I know that oftentimes when the media is reporting some sort of lawsuit or legal action might be the more technically correct term, right? Because now we've cast a wider net. It feels like it's oftentimes it's federal, right? We're talking about federal courts, federal district courts, Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, whatever the case may be. Is that just because those are the big issues people are hearing about, and that's like, hey, the media, I'm going to run an article on this because people will click on that? Or are people also suing oftentimes at the state levels as well?
It goes both ways. We do see it in both state and federal court. Sometimes you file a lawsuit in state court and it gets removed to federal court. If there's a federal question, for example, they can always remove it to federal court. There's a distinction between state courts and federal courts. Federal courts are courts of limited jurisdiction. They can only hear cases and controversies, very limited cases that they can actually take on, whereas state courts are courts of general jurisdiction. They can hear a lot more cases that could come before them. So typically, there are probably many more cases filed in state court, but generally the ones that get the news coverage and are more exciting deal with federal constitutional rights, and those are the ones that have to go to federal court.
Now, judges are nominally a nonpartisan position, but in reality, particularly when we get to federal, a president has to appoint them. When we're talking about a state level, they typically rose to power and was elected with, in essence, some sort of party affiliation. There's exceptions to everything, for sure. But as a general rule, particularly these days, that's pretty safe to say. So with that in mind, does that influence where a plaintiff is going to file a lawsuit knowing, okay, I'm bringing this particular issue, this judge is going to be receptive to it, or is it just like, well, wherever?
Yeah, it really, there are set rules on where you can file, and you're limited by that, right? So if you're in a particular district, you may be required to file in that district if that's where everything happened. And some, state statutes may allow you to file in different areas. If you file something in a particular circuit, you might be able to, and there are multiple judges in that circuit, you might be able to file a motion to get a different judge in the circuit or something along those lines. So yeah, those are all considerations that go into a lawsuit. I mean, certainly all judges take the same oath, and all judges, are bound to the law, and they all uphold the law. But you certainly want to factor in everything along those lines.
So we know kind of some of the sexy cases that are out there, right? Because, again, we hear about them. But I have to assume that that's not the majority of cases out there when it comes to suing the government. What's like a typical – you're suing the government, you're in the trenches. What's like a typical case?
A typical case would be an individual who has some fundamental right that has been restricted of theirs. Whether it's free speech rights or maybe a religious right or something, something along those lines, a fundamental right, something they're guaranteed that's being taken away from them. Those suits would then get filed either in state or federal court, again, depending on what that is. Typically, these are not very fact intensive. Usually it's in most cases, in what we do, our type of law, public interest law, they're not like fact intensive cases that would go to a jury in most cases because the facts aren't in dispute. It's usually just the law. The government typically believes what they're doing is perfectly lawful and doesn't impact that fundamental right, and the individual obviously disagrees with them. So typically, procedurally, we would file the case. The government would answer. We would then talk to them maybe about some limited fact discovery if there is something out there, maybe an evidentiary hearing if there are some basic facts. But in most of these types of cases, they'd be resolved on summary judgment on the merits stage. Now, as you get into the lawsuit, if there's some ongoing, something that's restricting that right away, you'd seek what's called a preliminary injunction. You'd ask the court to put whatever's being done on hold at the front end to protect those constitutional rights from being restricted while the lawsuit moves forward. And that's very common, especially in these types of individual rights cases, that you would have that preliminary injunction request. And a lot of times the lawsuit itself can hinge effectively on whether that's granted or denied.
We have a lot of attorneys out there. Some people would even say too many. I know, right? Yeah, and I always like to say that the problem with attorneys is 99% of attorneys give us 1% a bad name. My view on it, right? But don't ask my wife. But right. So one question I have for you is, I've been wronged by the government. I want to sue the government. Do I just call up the local, hit in a car, call us guy? Or somebody's watching this video in Oklahoma, in Washington State, in New York, and wherever. How do they find an organization like you? Is that something that you guys would help them out on potentially, or just who are they looking for?
Yeah, I think you need an attorney who's competent in that area, and most attorneys will be happy to tell you if it's an area of the law that they practice in. It depends on really what the harm is, and you want to find an attorney who specializes in that particular type of harm to give you the best representation. And then it's really just about calling around until you find somebody who's able to take your case. Typically, if we can't take a case, we always refer it out to somebody who we think might be able to, try to give them some options. We certainly can't take every case that comes in our door, and no attorney could. But yeah, that's kind of the process you go through. You want to find an attorney who knows that area of the law and who's going to be able to represent you zealously in it.
I want to talk about money. But before I do, I want to take a moment. If you enjoyed this video, if you made it this far, first off, thanks for sticking around. Secondly, please consider clicking like on the video. It lets us know that this was a worthwhile video. We should do more videos like it. It also lets the algorithm know this was a worthwhile video. Other people should see this as well. To make sure you don't miss any of our future content, please consider clicking subscribe. And of course, comment down below. What would you like to see Attorney Vebber come back and answer? Hopefully, if we can bring him back here. And well, what kind of questions did we miss? And just what kind of things fascinate you in this particular area of law? Also, if you want to show your support for Attorney Vebber, please consider checking out the link in the description box below to the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. They're a nonprofit 501c3, so any donation is a tax write-off for you. If you want to be able to support their work, chip in a couple bucks. I'm sure they would appreciate it. And even if you don't have a couple bucks right now, please consider just leaving them a 5-star review on Google. Just Google up Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, click write a review. Otherwise, we don't want all the people leaving reviews on there to be people that, you know, are pro-government and they've pissed off in essence. So please consider to take a moment to show your support there. All right, so let's talk money. How much money is it going to take me to hire an attorney to sue the government?
So it really depends on the type of case. It depends on how much is going to go into it. It's going to depend on what the attorney's going to charge for their hourly rate. I work for a group that doesn't charge our clients. We are a public interest law firm. We are funded by donors who support the work that we do. We only bring cases that are within our mission, but we don't charge our clients. And sometimes at the back end on these types of cases, you can also recover your fees. So many attorneys would be interested in taking some of these cases on contingent fee basis, which means you wouldn't have to put anything out at the front end. They would just say, hey, we'll take your case, we will front the money, and then at the back end, if we can recover our fees, we'll get paid that way. So there really are a variety of options as to how it could go forward. And it depends on what the type of harm is, which is what kind of suit you're going to bring as to how those things could play out.
So I'm going to give you one of the common questions I get, right? So as a criminal defense attorney, we're the largest criminal defense firm in the state of Wisconsin. I get a call from someone who says, yeah, you know, I was arrested because of XYZ, whatever, insert reason here. And, you know, the cops, they put on the handcuffs just a little too tight. I want to sue them for $1 million, right? What kind of cases are just like, don't even bother? And what kind of cases should people be thinking about?
You know, I think typically speaking, if you've actually been physically harmed and you can show some harm, you have to be able to prove that your harm cost you something. There has to be some pain inside. You know, you have to be able to prove damages in order to get damages. Courts can also award punitive damages in some cases, but again, that's all subject to sovereign immunity. So the government has to not only allow you to sue them, but they have to also allow you to recover damages against them. And that all kind of goes into the conversation you want to have with your attorney on any of these cases as to what the likelihood of being able to recover would be, and would certainly encourage anybody to have those conversations as quickly as possible.
So if I get rear-ended at a stoplight, I'm better off that they're driving a Lexus and not a municipal dump truck is what I'm hearing?
Yes.
All right. That feels like a good place to end it. So Lucas, as always, thanks for coming in. And again, thank you Down the Lens for sticking around this long. We will see you in the next one. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this one, please feel free to check out some of our other great content, and we'll see you in the next one.